Hello, welcome everyone to Venable's post-election webinar on nonprofits. It is the 9th installment of our post-election webinar series. If you missed some of our earlier sessions on topics including the corporate, consumer protection, government contracts, healthcare, and real estate outlooks, please see our website for links to those presentations, and they're available there. Later this week, in addition to this one, you can hear about the election's impact on the infrastructure industry, transportation, and international trade. And the details on how to join each of those can also be found on our website. Today we'll focus on nonprofits, which is a critical topic as we sit here today with so many parts of this sector suffering due to direct and indirect effects of the pandemic. And we've got a great crew here. I'm George Constantine. I'm co-chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice Group, one of the participants today. I'm joined here today with two colleagues from the Legislative Practice Group, Donovan and Gill, and also Cindy Lewin, who is a co-chair with me of the Nonprofit Organizations Group, is here, as well as Lindsay Nathan from the Political Law Practice of Venable. We'll attempt to address questions as they arise during our session today and also at the end. So please feel free to submit them through the chat feature while fresh in your minds and in real time as we move through the presentation. If prior sessions are any indication, we may not need the full hour for the presentation. Just a heads up on that. And just to kind of frame the issues a little bit before getting started, and I turn it over to my colleagues, I want to start by noting that just the term nonprofit is Cindy, Lindsay, and I know very well, working in this area, is a very broad term, encompasses a lot of different types of organizations with disparate interests and disparate missions. Oftentimes, nonprofits are on multiple sides of the same issue. So when we talk about nonprofits for purposes of this call, we're thinking about all of the above: the traditional institutional 501c3 public charity organizations, private foundations, 501c4 issue-based groups that may have a lobbying or political activities, and 501c6 trade associations and professional societies. And as you'll hear, the new administration is likely to be viewed as welcome news by some groups and not so good news by others. For a specific example, many of the trade associations we work with that represent manufacturing and building industry groups are no doubt wary of a potential return to more stringent environmental and labor regulations, which may be coming, and you'll hear about some more later in this program from a Biden administration. But on the other hand, those who work with international development nonprofits or who work in areas of education may be anticipating greater focus from the administration on those issues, as well as perhaps more grant money. So we kind of have a mixed bag. We're going to try to cover from a very high level those different impacts and different potential results of a Biden administration and the new Congress. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cindy. She'll introduce herself and give some opening remarks, followed by Lindsay, then Sarah, then Greg. So Lindsay, over to you. Cindy, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, George. And as George said, I'm the other co-chair of Venable's Nonprofit Organizations Practice. But before I came to Venable, I was general counsel at 3 large national nonprofits: Volunteers of America, National Wildlife Federation, and most recently AARP. So having that inside perspective as well as the outside counsel perspective, I try to think about the practical impacts of changes, and what are the changes? What are the changes you should be making as you think about what might be coming? So I'll be talking later on. I may not be right about those things, but I'll be talking later on about the possible tax impacts, and particularly how those might affect fundraising. So we're particularly focused on C3s. Lindsay?
Thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you so much, George, for the introduction. My name is Lindsay Nathan. I am a counsel in Venable's Political Law Practice Group, and I'm based in New York City. Prior to coming to Venable, just over a year ago, I was the chief in-house counsel for Everytown for Gun Safety, which is the nation's largest gun violence prevention organization, which had a 501c3, 501c4, and some affiliated PACs as well. I also held multiple roles in the administration of Governor Andrew Cuomo prior to entering into the nonprofit world. So I have a little bit of government experience as well, although not as much on the federal side. I will be talking a little bit about the political and lobbying regulation, the current environment, and how there may be some loosening or tightening of the regulations that have existed under Trump and how that will change under a Biden administration. I look forward to speaking to all of you, and on to Sarah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Let me advance the slide here, Sarah, and then we'll turn it over to,
sure.
to Sarah and Greg. And just want on the outset, we're talking sort of at a big picture level for the first few slides on the election and some of those larger impacts, and then we'll try to get into more specific issues as we progress through. So over to you, Sarah.
Sure. I'm Sarah Donovan. I'm a senior policy advisor in the legislative practice group at Venable. And prior to joining Venable, I've been here about 2.5 years now. Before that, I was in the legislative practice group over at a large international law firm, also in town. So I've been working on the Hill and around the Hill in the administration for quite a while. And before I kick things off, I'll kick it over to Greg, who is my co-chair on VenPAC and my partner in the legislative group.
Greg, you may be muted.
Great.
Yes, I was. I was following the instructions. I'm sorry. So my name is Greg Gill. Pleasure to be with you today. I've been at Venable a little over 10 years. Prior to that, I was with another lobbying organization. I'm a former Democratic staff on the House and the Senate side of the Capitol, and I've represented a number of nonprofits, including hospitals and universities, groups interested in immigration, and also nonprofit, healthcare nonprofit organizations like Cannonball Kids, which is a pediatric cancer organization. Look forward to talking with you. Sarah?
Sure. All right, I'll kick things off. The first slide that you have in front of you is the results of the presidential election for 2020. Even though President Trump has not conceded, we are all on this call, and I'm sure all of you are on the phone, are moving forward with the assumption that Joe Biden is the president-elect. And just today, I think he started, or maybe in the past couple days, he started receiving the national security briefing. So we've turned a corner on the government recognizing him as the president-elect, and so he's now able to start receiving the information that he needs in order to get ready to assume the presidency next month. So here you have a map. I don't think we necessarily need to go through it, but suffice it to say that he has the necessary number of electoral college votes. We don't really see the effort that is underway in order to sway these individual electoral college voters. We do not believe that they will be successful in upending the results of the presidential election. So I think that's all we need to say on this. And I'll turn it over to Greg to talk about the Senate.
So in the Senate, we now currently have a margin of 53 Republicans to 52 Democrats. The second point on our slide says that Republicans were able to flip Alabama, which was a pretty easy flip since that was going to go red anyway. And I think in the Senate, it's going to be difficult, much like in the House, to govern because of the slim margin. Obviously, we have to wait on Georgia to see what happens there. And the politics in Georgia are particularly complicated given the president's upcoming visit to Georgia, people in Georgia. Some Republicans in Georgia are suggesting that the two Republican candidates are not doing enough to ensure a fair election, meaning Georgia stays red. Next slide. Sarah?
Yep. So I'll talk about the next 60 days or so. How long can it take to finalize the results of the presidential election? I think this has pretty well been answered. The states have been certifying, so we're moving forward on the assumption that we have a Vice President Biden. As Greg mentioned on the earlier slide, there are two runoff races in Georgia for the 2 Senate seats. And that election, those 2 elections will be on January the 5th. And so we should have a pretty clear indication shortly thereafter on the results of those and the balance of Senate. And as he mentioned, both the House and the Senate are operating on very slim margins. And so it will make governing, difficult for those in leadership. They'll need to hold their caucus and conferences together. There's, historically in the past several Congresses been a bit of a split among House Republicans with the Tea Partiers and then the Freedom Caucus. They were not always sure votes for Republican priorities. And we may see the same thing happen on the House side with the Democrats. And the same thing is going to be true in the Senate, where you now have people that are considered perhaps swing voters become very important to how the Senate will operate. We mentioned here that the government funding runs out as of December 11th. This is because our fiscal year begins and ends September 30th. So right before the end of the previous fiscal year, the Congress voted for and the President signed a continuing resolution, a CR, to fund the government through December 11th. So before December 11th, Congress will need to pass some sort of funding bill, whether that's another continuing resolution or some combination of that and an omnibus before the 11th. Otherwise, we have a government shutdown on our hands. And I don't think that is in anyone's, that's not something anyone wants.
And the latest, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, in the latest from the Hill, is that both houses are in session now. It appears that there's a tentative deal on a new continuing resolution to pass the appropriations bills, but I wouldn't place any bets on it just yet. And then on the next slide on the COVID legislation, it appears that there's some interest in negotiating a smaller COVID package. Again, the chances of it passing before Congress adjourns is very unclear, and what would be included in it, what would be excluded in it is still up in the air, but at least they're talking, so that's progress.
Right. I think what we've been telling clients is that a Congress that can work together on funding the government is one that can work together on other things. So I think that bodes well for a functional Congress. And lastly, will Trump sign any bill coming to him? Wow, that's anyone's guess. And I think, and everything that we've heard directly from the White House and through the media, they are messaging that he has no reason to not sign the things that are coming to him. What we've been hearing more quietly is that Congress is modifying bills now that they're intending to send to his desk for signature in order to ensure that they are signed. So I think that while he will probably sign what comes across his desk, it's been modified in order to make that so. And that's been our experience in working with the Hill. So Greg, anything else to add?
Yeah, if I could add, I would say that my experience, I think, is playing out here, is that most members of Congress, with exceptions of the fringes on each side of the party, see passing appropriations bills as regular business and regular order, and would like to get back to some sort of semblance of that. And so I do think there's some interest in that. Whether they can succeed is a different question.
Agree.
So we go to the next slide on the Congress. Sarah?
Sure, I'll take this. I'll start here. You're looking at what we see as some of the leadership of both chambers, and then also some of the key committee chairs for nonprofits on the phone with us today. Nancy Pelosi will return as Speaker next Congress on the 117th, and Mitch McConnell, whether or not he is majority leader or minority leader, he's going to stay head of the party, so no real shakeups there. I'll take the House committees if you want to talk a little bit about the Senate committees, Greg. On the House side, there is currently a race to replace Chairwoman Lowy from New York, who is currently the chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee. There are several members running for that seat. I think that the downtown money is probably on Rosa DeLauro, but I'll let Greg fill in if he disagrees. And then on the Tax Writing Committee, we expect Richie Neal to come back as chair, Frank Pallone to come back at House Energy and Commerce Committee, and Chairwoman Waters to return to the House Financial Services Committee.
And I'll just add that on House Appropriations, I think, well, DeLauro is probably in the lead, but the bottom line is the next chairman, the next chairperson of House Appropriations will be a woman. And, you know, with the House leadership, one of the issues they have is that the three highest members are over in leadership, House leadership, are over 78 years old. And so at some point they need to figure out a changing of the guard and how that changes in a way that doesn't disrupt the party. The other thing I'd mention about the House is that House Republicans did a great job in electing more women. And then from the flip side, you know, we thought, at least some people at the Democratic Party thought there would be a blue tsunami in the House, and the House margin of victory for the Democrats has actually shrunk. On the Senate side, you'll see that the leadership is all Republican, because as of this point, I think that's the way it will stay, unless there's a dramatic flip in Georgia. And again, the margins in the Senate side are going to make it difficult to govern, but I think it may also, at some extent, force people to sit down and have conversations.
That's right. And a few notable things on the Senate committee chairs. I mean, they're listed as committee chairs, but they could very well be ranking members here, depending on the Georgia races. There's been some musical chairs, as we like to call it. So on Appropriations, Senator Shelby will be returning, and Senator Wicker will be returning as Senator Commerce. Now, because of some term limits that are due to internal party rules for Republicans in the Senate, we will have Mike Crapo move to Senate Finance. This is because Senator Grassley is moving over to Judiciary to finish out his last 2 years of eligibility there. So that opens up Senate Finance. So Senator Crapo is moving over there. Now, because Crapo is moving from banking, Senator Toomey is moving up into the top Republican spot. And one more thing that's not on here that I think is probably of interest to a lot of the nonprofits that are on the call today is what's going to happen on the Help Committee. Chairman Alexander is retiring, and Senator Burr is next in line in terms of seniority. His staff would certainly tell you that he is planning to take over as top Republican of Help, even though his investigation is still outstanding. We haven't heard a resolution to that yet. But next in line in terms of seniority, should that not happen, is Senator Paul, then Senator Collins, and then Senator Cassidy from Louisiana. So we won't know until probably, I thought it was going to be after the election, but they're really dragging this one out. So we'll see soon enough who ends up being the top Republican on Help. But we're operating under the assumption there will likely be Senator Burr from North Carolina.
Okay.
And on the House side, the chairman of Ed and Labor would be Bobby Scott from Virginia.
Okay.
Next slide, I think.
The next slide?
Sure.
Okay. So I think we'll divide and conquer a little bit on this one. Right. Greg and I will take the first part, if that's okay with the group. So Greg already talked a little bit about this COVID-19 response. You know, could it be a stimulus? Yes or no, possibly coupled with infrastructure. I think there's a lot of discussion, and I don't want to rehash what Greg already shared with everyone, but this has been broadly agreed to that there should be another COVID response measure. The scope of that and the size of that and when that happens is left up to debate. But regardless of which party controls the Senate, I think that we'll see that. If it's Democrats, they will probably push for and achieve a much larger package that is more comprehensive. And if Republicans maintain control of the Senate, it could probably be more limited in scope and in dollar amount. So there are a lot of things that are expiring that were implemented as part of CARES. They're expiring at the end of the year. that need to be dealt with. The list is extensive. It includes federal student loan payments, eviction moratoriums, you name it, and unemployment insurance plus-ups. So the Congress will need to deal with these things. How they do that, I think, remains to be seen.
And
I don't know if Greg, if you
Sarah
have anything
and Greg,
you want to add on to that, or George.
Yeah, just a prompt question a little bit here. Greg, you mentioned sort of that possible skinny relief, sort of, is that in this interim time before inauguration that may have a little bit of relief coming through?
That's what we're hearing. That's a possibility.
Yeah. And then obviously, Sarah, you've been close to this, and you and I have talked about this many times since the various COVID relief packages have been passed. And one big frustration for the association community has been that the only nonprofits that benefit are 501c3s and 501c19 veterans organizations, and 6s and 4s are left outside, for example. I know there's been a lot of effort and some pretty vocal effort by groups like ASAE to change that. Anything, other than, anything that you sort of have seen or felt in part of these efforts to see how close they are to possibly allowing, as part of the qualification for receiving a PPP loan, if they continue in subsequent packages, that they would be broadened to include other nonprofits?
It's certainly possible. I would expect that something having to do with PPP would be included in the next COVID package. I think that it will look a lot like Rubio's second draw program language that he included as part of, they call it HEALS in the Senate, but this was the Senate Republican response, where we have HEROES in the House and HEALS in the Senate. It will probably look a lot like that, although it could have some changes depending on the input from his ranking member counterparts. But I would not expect it to necessarily move separately, but I think it could be a part of this package.
Right. And I know part of what we were hearing during the discussions that were going on earlier in 2020 about inclusion specifically of 501c6s was this concern, I think somewhat misguided, that C6s are lobbying organizations and this money would effectively be supporting lobbying. So I know hope springs eternal on that front.
Yes, and those organizations, as you mentioned, have been quite vocal, and from everything that I've heard from Senator Rubio directly, they've been heard. I have heard directly from him and from Senator Collins that they understand the role that those types of nonprofits play, both in their communities and then also in DC. They are enormous. They're a wealth of information and knowledge that members lean on. They are important organizations back in the states. They're employers, and so I know that those concerns have been heard. Whether or not that's enough to shove a change for them over the finish line, I'm not totally sure, because I have not heard someone say definitively yes or no, but I do know that those concerns have been held, and those organizations have done a great job of advocating for themselves.
Great. Thank you.
And on immigration, I think significant change is going to come from the administration through just their own actions. I mean, obviously the current administration was very antagonistic to immigration, to refugee assistance programs, et cetera. And I think one of the first steps in the first 60 days, first 100 days, is going to be to roll back a lot of those restrictions and to rethink what we're doing on refugee assistance and immigration. And then clearly there will be additional, I think, a legislative push, because I think there, as we point out here, there's significant support on the Senate side, in both parties. So I think there will be a significant rethinking, both administratively and legislatively, on our refugee policies and immigration policies. Sarah, anything to add?
I don't have anything to add, except for I think Biden has signaled that one of the first things he wants to do is send over an immigration bill to the Congress. So I think that shows how high up on his priority list it is.
Yeah.
And similarly, when it comes to climate and the environment, I think that's also pretty high on his list. One of the first people that he named that would be part of his core team was Senator Kerry. And as sort of this overarching climate czar, I don't know why I use that term, but we do. And so I think that really shows how important this issue is to President-elect Biden and where he places that on his first 100 days. So I think that's going to be a big focus. This is not an area that I typically do a lot of work in, so I don't want to pretend that I'm some sort of climate expert, but I will say that it's notable that he did that, and he did it early on, and that it's something that he said is very important to him. Things like reentering the Paris Agreement. We're going to talk later on about regulations and deregulations. So we definitely expect this to come up early and often.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree that this will have an impact on a lot of nonprofits, just as I said at the outset, depending on the focus of your nonprofit, in different ways, but a lot of nonprofits are paying close attention to what's going to happen on the environmental front.
Sarah and Greg, one of the, just moving on for a moment from the climate, one of the big issues on everyone's mind right now after this election is voting rights. So do either of you have any thoughts about whether H.R. 1, which is the For the People Act, which would enact automatic voter registration, require the president to disclose tax returns and institute public financing of federal campaigns, amongst other things, or the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is H.R. 4, which would reinstate portions of the Voting Rights Act that were invalidated by the Supreme Court in 2013. Do you have any sense of whether either of those bills have any chance of moving during the next Congress?
I think both, this is Greg, I think both the bills will move quickly in the House and early on in the session, and I think they will be passed. The question is, what happens, in my view, what happens on the Senate side? But I think there's very strong support among Democrats on the House side. Even given their slim majority, there won't be any Democratic votes against it. There probably will be some Republican support. And the question is, how can they marshal their troops on the Senate side? Sarah?
I think that's right. I think it really depends on who ends up controlling the Senate, on the path that something like that would take in that chamber. It's pretty difficult to make. I mean, I know Greg you seem more comfortable calling it for Republicans right now. I'm less so. I think that Georgia has this, as a state, has there's been some really interesting trends there this election cycle that maybe things will play out a little bit different than we expect. But on voting rights specifically, I think it's going to be largely dependent on the outcome of those two races.
Okay. I think we're ready to move on to the next slide, unless there's anything else, Lindsay, you wanted to add on the HR 1 side?
No, that's super helpful. Thank you.
We've got a question, I think, that is worth addressing.
Right.
And that's on our comment that, oh, go ahead, Cindy. I'm sorry.
No, you go, Sarah. Go ahead.
Can we elaborate on possibly coupled with infrastructure with regards to COVID response package? I think that infrastructure could be coupled with that because infrastructure would be a stimulus package. So would something on that travel along with other COVID response measures, which would be a different path than doing another, CARES 2.0 style bill. And I think I'd like to hear from Greg on his thoughts. But the idea is that an infrastructure bill would be a stimulus bill, and that would be a source of funds and jobs And so those two things could move together. It would also probably make it a little bit easier, to pass some additional money as part of COVID response for other things, because the dollar amount sort of gets all lumped together, and you can't necessarily call out the top line number in the same way you would if it was a specific, COVID relief measure.
Sarah, I think you're right. I think, again, it all goes back to Georgia, maybe, because if Congress decides to do a comprehensive infrastructure bill, the level of funding in that thing could be huge. And then whether they have the stomach or the will to add on to that funding for COVID is a question that I don't know that any of us can answer now, but it would seem to make sense that it would be a good vehicle for a writer, but it might become so large that they couldn't pass it.
Good. Okay. I'll move on to the next slide, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Greg, we're going to ask you to talk a little bit about the authorizing bills.
Yeah. For those who don't do this on a regular basis, there can be some confusion between authorizing bills and appropriations bills. For instance, a continuing resolution is obviously an appropriation bill. The ones we have listed here are authorization bills. Typically speaking, before funding can be appropriated for a program, it has to be authorized. And the issue we've had in the last several years, as you will see, a number of the authorizations have expired for one political reason or another. I would hope and I would think that in the next Congress, they will be able to pass a new higher education reauthorization bill, which will have funding for new programs. It will delete some of the old programs that no longer need to be authorized. And, it could be also that we have another edition of ACA. But there's some also other bills you see here that have their funding has expired, and hopefully Congress will get around to authorizing them. There was one we talked about a little bit earlier, the National Defense Authorization Act is, again, an authorization bill, and that's the bill where there's now the fight in Congress as to whether we're going to rename some of the bases that were named after former Confederate generals. Again, that's an authorization bill. It includes issues and funding for various new programs and deletes old funding for other programs or, obsolete military programs. And then the DOD appropriations bill, what follows that bill and appropriates money based on what's authorized. Sarah, you want to add anything?
Nope. I agree with everything you said.
Yeah. Great. See, there's progress.
So this is George, and I'm going to talk a little bit on this slide about spending, and particularly its sort of, relationship and impact on nonprofits, particularly those that may rely on government grants, understanding with the caveat that I certainly am no prognosticator, but I mean, the general concept here is that spending on, at least spending priorities for a Democratic administration like a Biden administration are going to be vastly different from those in the Trump administration. And some areas that have not had perhaps as much attention and financial support under Trump are likely to be revitalized under Biden's priorities. Obviously, we did talk a lot about stimulus and COVID-19 relief packages, and I think there's a lot of consensus that the administration will be pushing that. What remains to be seen, of course, is the agreement between House, Senate, and administration on size and scope. On the grant program side, doing a little bit of homework for this, looking at some publications that perhaps are better at prognosticating than I could be, really sort of point out potential increased grant money being available in the area of science, particularly with climate change, medicine. Other environmental causes are likely to be more apt to receive government funding than under the Trump administration. USAID, there's some speculation in the trade press that we'll may see some revitalization and a greater emphasis on funding. Obviously, that has to come from Congress, but there will be an administration push to rebuild that agency, and particularly and when it comes to focus on the types of programs that might receive more funding and more attention under USAID are those involving developing countries benefiting women and girls. Those initiatives have been a big part of the Biden campaign literature, and it's a focus of what he wants to do. And then finally, education. There seems to be a tremendous push under his policy papers that have been published, since the general election really started, that really emphasize a push on spending there. So if you're a nonprofit in those areas, obviously this is an opportunity. The general consensus is that, if there is, likely to be a decrease in spending under a Biden administration, Democratic administration, it's probably on the defense side of things. And
George, can I add something?
I'll turn this. Yeah, go ahead, Greg. And I've got.
So, I think in the real world, what happens is that the president submits his budget, and let's look at the current administration. So, for the current administration, the president submitted budgets that would either decrease or zero fund a number of the programs that George has talked about: USAID, refugee assistance, and then the members of the Appropriations Committee, particularly on the Democratic side, would make proposals to provide additional funding for those programs over and above the president's request, and would basically be in a negotiation with the majority on the Republican side, on the Senate side, to have funding at a level that was somewhat close to what it had been prior to the Trump administration. Now that we have a Biden administration coming in, I don't see that as a big fight anymore among appropriators. Obviously, he's going to put more money in for the programs some of the programs that George just mentioned, and less in the area of defense.
Right. Thank you. And one important point here, to interrupt our regularly scheduled programming, to announce the CLE code for everyone. The CLE code for this program is Nonprofit 2020. That's Nonprofit 2020. Okay, and then there are some bigger picture items on the spending side related to the law that has placed caps on types of spending, which will expire as of fiscal year 2022. There has been some talk, and I'll go back to Greg on this, about reinstituting something that hasn't been around in a while, the earmark spending.
Yeah, and there's some discussion, particularly in the House side, about opening it up again and establishing a system whereby if earmarks are provided, that they're provided to public institutions, and that there be some transparency. It's still a work in progress. Part of it depends on who becomes the next chairperson of the House Appropriations Committee. There are some who strongly support the push and others who don't. One of the arguments that has been made is that earmarks in and of themselves are not evil, but we need to figure out a way to control them, bring transparency to the process, and it also may help pass legislation on the floor.
Great. So that's sort of the very big picture outlook on the spending side and how that might affect nonprofits, particularly those that rely on or like to have grants from the government. And we'll talk a little bit about the regulation side. We've been talking a lot about legislation and not as much about the agency action. As I said at the outset, everyone expects that the EPA will become a probably more aggressive agency again than under Trump, and there likely will be significant rollbacks and overturning of a lot of the regulatory actions that happen with EPA. There's this sort of day one promise that Biden has made on a number of different regulations. I will say the one thing that a lot of trade associations, in particular in the building and manufacturing fields, are watching closely are, those that have to do with the Clean Power Plan that was under the Obama administration and substantially revised under Trump. Is that coming back? There's been at least some discussion of that coming back with the Biden administration. And as well, a lot of labor regulations have been loosened, and interpretations of existing rules have been more sort of employer friendly over the last 4 years. I think there's a lot of attention being paid now to whether those will be likely, rolled back or stiffened again to reflect the policy preferences of the Biden administration. And then there's this sort of notion of the Congressional Review Act, which I think we're going to talk about more on the next slide.
So I'll talk a little bit about
Go ahead.
Sorry, the audio's delayed on my side, George. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go.
On the CRA, the Congressional Review Act, we put this in here. I think whether or not this tool is used is, I keep saying this, I sound like a broken record, but it's largely dependent on the outcome of the Georgia elections. If there's a Democratic Senate majority, then it makes the use of this, I would say, significantly more likely than if there's a Republican Senate. And so I thought it'd be, useful for us to just briefly touch on this. Obviously, we can offer a lot more information on this if anyone on this call is interested. But as far as an overview is concerned, the CRA is a congressional oversight tool. It's been used 17 times in our history, and 16 of those times were at the beginning of the Trump administration. So this was used one time before then. So that is to say that it's not been something that's really been used before, and some of the this was popularized by certain members of Congress and certain staff in the White House at the beginning of the Trump administration as a tool that could be used to roll back Obama-era regs on things that they did not want, that they disagreed with. So what it does is it provides a fast-track consideration in the Senate if it's within a 60-session-day look-back period. So these would be regulations that potentially that Trump implemented within 60 days of whenever the CRA is considered in the Congress. And what it does is it invalidates the entire rule. This is like a very blunt instrument. It's the whole thing. And what happens is that not only does it invalidate the entire rule, but it also then prohibits that agency from promulgating a rule in quote unquote substantially the same form. So it can be double-edged in that way. If you use the CRA to get rid of some environmental regulation, you cannot then issue a new regulation dealing with that thing. Now, how closely those things, that new reg that's replacing this old one that was done away with CRA, it's probably going to end up in the courts on what does substantially the same form mean, because that has not been really clearly defined before, mostly because it was only used one time in history before the beginning of the Trump administration. So again, I don't think it's likely that we'll see this in a Republican Senate, but I think it's worth putting out there so you're aware of it in case you get questions within your organization, you hear about it in the news, or especially if both those Senate seats in Georgia go Democratic.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that overview. And with that, we're going to move on to what I think is probably the one area where there's tremendous commonality among all the different types of nonprofits that are listening to this, and that's on the tax front, because all of us, regardless of what position we may have on particular issues, all of us are subject to the same sections of the tax code and the restrictions on unrelated business activities and the like. So with that, I know Cindy was going to take the lead on this slide, so I'll turn it over to you, Cindy.
All right. Thank you, George, and please feel free to chime in. And yeah, I thought that on this webinar we were going to find out who was going to win in Georgia. So Sarah, I'm very disappointed because you're right, so much hinges on that and what to expect.
It really
is. So everybody wants to know, this is an issue, certainly a campaign issue. What would a Biden administration do with taxes? And I think to understand why the sort of big picture impact on nonprofits, we take a step back and look at what the Trump administration tax bill did. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was enacted at the end of 2017 and took effect in 2018. And in order to simplify and streamline the tax code, the standard deduction was really increased and some itemized deductions were gotten rid of, with the net result that a lot of taxpayers no longer need to itemize their deductions, which means that those taxpayers that don't itemize don't get a charitable deduction. And that's an estimated 21 million taxpayers starting in 2018 were no longer itemizing and therefore no longer incentivized by the tax system to make charitable contributions. And it's not spread universally over the world of potential donors, because higher income taxpayers still itemize, whereas middle class and working class donors are less likely to itemize. So, and there's a lot of talk about how, well, higher income taxpayers, they're the elites, they just sponsor symphonies and the opera and museums and universities, and it's the middle class and working class that donate and support so many human services. So a lot of concern about that, but the big picture was the sense that, the estimates were that $3 to $5 billion in charitable donations were going to be lost due to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act over the next few years after it was enacted. And that the big news is that does not appear to have happened. And as we look at what the Biden administration tax bill might do, I think it's important to understand that. So 2017, we thought 2018 would be the year that contributions went down. And they did. So we were convinced that it was the beginning of the slide, the beginning of the end. But in fact, it seems like 2017 was one of the biggest years ever, because people saw they were going to lose their deduction, and there seems to be a timing difference. Everybody rushed to make their donations in 2017, so that was a big year. 2018 was definitely down, but 2019 came right back and matched 2017 almost. So, we don't seem to be as motivated by the charitable deduction as we thought, and I think that was very interesting. Of course, who knows what's going to happen in 2020? There are a lot of things going on in 2020, and I don't think we'll be able to isolate the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. But so we didn't see those big impacts that we thought. And so if Joe Biden, so there's less pressure to undo that, at least less pressure from charities. And if Joe Biden increases tax rates on individuals who are earning $400,000 and up, that will make giving more attractive to them, make the charitable deduction worth more, unless it's done in some way that caps itemized deductions, which has happened in the past. So we'll see what happens. But that could be a good thing for charities. And overall, this hasn't been a bad thing. But as you look ahead, you might think about what your strategy is for reaching out to those higher income donors if you're a C3. So that's the individual side. On the corporate side, Joe Biden talked about increasing corporate tax rates. The Trump administration bill made them really low and made them a flat rate of 21%. Maybe they'll go back up to the high 30s. And that should incentivize corporate giving. But what we've been seeing in the last few years is what's really driving corporate giving is the sense that among the millennials and Gen Y in particular, you really see corporations giving because those audiences, those potential customers and consumers want to know that they're doing business with a socially, a company with a good social purpose. So we're seeing a lot of corporations that want to do, that want to be seen as proud sponsors of certain charitable causes, or want to do charitable sales promotions, buy one, give one, or, cause-related marketing. For every T-shirt bought, we'll give 20 cents to a particular cause. And not all of those even have to be driven by charitable contributions. So we're still expecting to see strong appetite for charitable giving on the corporate side, and not expecting to see changes in those rules either way. So presumably, particularly if you have a high visibility brand, you're looking at your corporate strategy, and I think that's something that is worth continuing to look at. Tax Cut and Jobs Act basically eliminated the charitable deduction for bequests. In practice, the deduction is still there, but the exemption for estates was doubled to $11 million for singles, $22 million for married couples, roughly. and that excluded all but a few thousand estates each year from paying the estate tax at all. So the charitable motivation to charitable bequests, it was gone for almost every estate. Joe Biden has talked about bringing it back, cutting that exemption way back, which would restore a charitable incentive. We don't know, unlike what we saw with individual giving, where we saw that there were other motives than taxes for people giving. We didn't have time to find out. We haven't had time yet to find out. People need to change their wills and then die and then pay their estate tax, and that takes a couple of years. So we don't know if it would make a huge difference. But the projections were that the change in tax law was going to drive a huge cut in charitable bequests. So if the Biden administration changed the rules back, that could be helpful for charities. A couple of specific provisions that related to nonprofits in that Tax Cut and Jobs Act. One was the tax on executive compensation, particularly of interest to a lot of our 501c6 organizations that we work with. That was the 21% excise tax on the portion of executive compensation over $1 million. And it could also hit executives who are making much less if they had deferred compensation that was vesting. And also could hit some severance payments. So there was a lot of concern, we'll see. I think that many organizations in the nonprofit world want to lobby on this and see if they can get a pushback now, and whether they can remains to be seen. I don't know, Sarah and Greg, if you've heard anything about that, but I think it's still up in the air. So, assuming you haven't.
I have not.
I know. Good. I know. I appreciate everybody being on mute. A second one was the excise tax on the investment income of certain private colleges and universities. This was definitely targeted at organizations with big endowments. The excise tax was only 1.4%, which might not sound like a lot, but for those colleges and universities with the really big endowments, it is a lot. It's millions of dollars. Stanford has said that for 2019, it would owe $43 million. Harvard, $38 million in 2019. So those are big, big numbers. But the tax is could only possibly apply to about 40 colleges and universities. And but for those, they are lobbying hard to get rid of it. I don't know that it is really a partisan issue. The original push for it did come from Republicans. Back in 2016, Senator Hatch, in his role as chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and Kevin Brady, who was chair of the House Ways and Means, were really pushing that universities shouldn't be sitting on these mountains of money. They should be using them to help their students, and they shouldn't be jacking up tuition. And again, that wasn't necessarily a position that no Democrats had a sneaking sympathy for. So I don't know that this is a partisan issue. This was an attempt to push people to change the way they manage their endowments, and we'll see what happens. They would certainly like to see this changed. And of course, there is a sense that there were other attacks on higher education as the liberal bastions of academia, and we'll see what happens there. Which brings us to the last bullet on this slide before I go back to Lindsay to talk about donor disclosure, which is the idea that nonprofits are sitting on piles and piles of money that should be out doing good. Private foundations already have a required payout. Private foundations tend to have a big mountain of principal and spend the interest or the investment income each year. They have to spend at least 5%. There is talk about raising that. But donor-advised funds are a newer vehicle. Private foundations were subject to a lot of regulations, a lot of statutory restrictions that were passed in the 60s. Donor-advised funds don't have a minimum payout, and there is a lot of sense that people take a charitable deduction now, pile up the money in the donor-advised fund, and don't spend it for many years. They say they're saving it for a rainy day. But when I look outside, not only is it raining here in Washington, D.C., but there's sort of a pandemic, a few other things that makes now seem like a really rainy day. So it will be interesting to see. And again, I don't think that's a partisan idea. I think people again, particularly in academia, have expressed a lot of concern about whether this makes any sense at all. So it would be interesting. I know that Democrats are raising this, but it will be interesting to see what happens here. In terms of IRS, in terms of whether the IRS will get more funding, which has been an issue, whether we can really have a functioning tax system when we continue to lose budget and jobs at the IRS level. I don't know that anything is going to change there. I know we would all love to be able to get our exemptions for our applications for exemption processed and be able to get letters from the IRS confirming that we're exempt organizations after we changed our name or things like that. Those things are taking a really long time. The pandemic has made it even worse, although some of the technological improvements are starting to make a difference on the IRS side to make it better. I don't know that this is just going to rise to being a big issue here, but we'll see. Even under the Obama administration, I didn't see the IRS getting, at least in the nonprofit side, getting tons and tons of funding. So not holding my breath for that. George, sure, anyone, do you have anything to add? Yeah.
I would just say that goes to the enforcement side of things too. And, there's I think we can all agree kind of lax enforcement going on right now, at least in the exempt organizations community, just because the lack of funds for the agency to fund audits and examinations. So it's hard to say that, a Biden administration will change that because the money has to come first. But there's a question that just came through, do you think there'll be a heightened attention to enforcing the ban on political activity for 501c3 organizations, which, seems to have gone away or at least been pretty close to non-existent in these recent years. And I can say, honestly, I don't see that happening anytime soon unless there's a tremendous attention paid to it and funds given generally to the IRS to help with enforcement. My take on that is it seems unlikely.
Well, I know we're running out of time, so I want to call on Lindsay to talk about donor disclosure and other. There's a great question on DAFs, but we'll hold that because we don't know the answer. I don't know if there'll be a community foundation carve-out. There'll certainly be a lot of lobbying on that. And with that, over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Cindy. So as many of our nonprofit clients are keenly aware, earlier this year, the U.S. Treasury finalized regulations that allowed many nonprofits, except 501c3 and 527 organizations, to avoid disclosing donors on Schedule B, which is the schedule of contributors on their annual Form 990s. So currently 501c4s, 501c5s, and 501c6s no longer have to include Schedule B, except that it's sort of a weird predicament because certain states such as California, New Jersey, and New York still require that information to be submitted as part of their charitable solicitation filings. It's possible that the incoming Biden administration will roll back some of those provisions, although since the regulations have been finalized and it does take a while to get through the process, the timeline for reinstating some of those donor disclosure provisions is a little unclear.
Okay, I think then we're on to the last slide here. Thanks, Lindsay. And it is our last slide. Maybe if there's any sort of last words from Sarah and Greg in particular on these other spending priorities, now's your chance.
Sarah, ladies first.
Oh, thanks. I think generally speaking, this is just like our catch-all, like what didn't we cover, what else should we mention? So we broadly speaking, with the Democratic administration, we expect policy changes in these areas that we've listed here. I would mention that particularly when it comes to healthcare, I think that that's something that's on a lot of people's minds, that this will, like all these things, really to be dependent on who controls the Senate. But with regards to healthcare specifically, I think that with a Republican Senate, you'll see any changes to healthcare will probably be more of an administration lead. With the exceptions of maybe surprise billing, which has like broad bipartisan support, things like cosmetics legislation, that sort of thing. You can see some legislation there. but largely you'll have an administration lead on things that they can do via, regulations or executive orders. So maybe some things around making some of these changes to telehealth more permanent, things like that. With a Democratic Senate, that's when you really start opening it up and could see some real changes via the legislative process. So do you have expand access to health care even further? Maybe there's a public option. Do you start doing some interesting things there? So I'll turn it over to Greg to maybe address some of the other ones, but those are my thoughts.
Well, looks like we're about to run out of time, but I would basically close by saying, I think minimum wage is going to be another issue that the Democrats will pursue in the House and particularly in the Senate as well. But I'll leave it at that.
Great. Listen, thanks to the panelists. This is a really informative hour. I really appreciate everyone's time. And thank you all for attending and participating and joining us for today's discussion. And please consider joining us for some of the other webinars on the election series and our regular nonprofit webinars as well. I think with that, unless I'm missing a task here, I think that's all I need to do to close this out.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.